Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll be considering what sort of political reforms today's socialists might be able to support now that our Trump-era social democratic realist turn has failed. Along the way I'll take excerpts from the Aufhebunga Bunga book, The End of History, and from The Writing on the Wall by Anselm Jappe. Walter Benjamin is often credited with saying that behind every fascism is a failed revolution. When we consider the current state of the left, especially when we think of the character of the American socialist turn that began in 2015 with the rise of Bernie Sanders, we might revise this aphorism a bit, tone it down a little. We might say that behind every turn to the right, there's a failed left project. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement set the stage for Sanders, and the turn to Sanders and the DSA amounted to the left's self-liquidation into the Democratic Party. Following the logic of Benjamin's assertion, now that the Sanders moment is in the past, American leftists risk taking yet another rightward turn. It could take the form of a defense of the Biden administration. It could take a contrarian form and amount to an embrace of populism and the Republican Party, or we could abandon the realm of politics altogether and reenact the 70s by turning inward, retreating into our personal lives. If we are to avoid turning to the right, we'll have to re-examine our assumptions. After Sanders, we'll have to discover the difference between reformist and radical politics. Nearly everything tries to pass itself off as radical or revolutionary today. Detergents, pop stars, magazines, and even bourgeois political parties attempt to appear as radical because in a society that is constantly changing, a society built on the promise of freedom, knowledge, and progress, the difference between radical change and the automatic change brought on by the fluctuations in the economy is hard to make out. Progressive capitalism sweeps every trend, every concept, every critique and rebellion into its own discourse. Even a term like socialism can be absorbed by the system, and in fact, this is precisely what has happened. Especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the radical left has been working with what can be charitably called a reformist notion of socialism, and with what might be better thought of as a progressive capitalist conception of socialism. This version of socialism became what defined the contemporary radical left starting about a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It arrived through the anti-WTO protests in Seattle, Washington, and then, as that movement disintegrated, it was taken up by NGOs, advocacy groups, and left media organizations, and expressed directly in the slogan, "Another world is possible." At the World Social Forum in 2001, the aim was to empower civil society against corporate power. In Marxist terms, it aimed to pit the realm of private individuals against capitalist monopolies and against the power of those states, or national governments, that serve those monopolies. It was, in its essence, reformist and even, at times, reactionary, as the realm of civil society is itself a product of both capital relations and national states. By pretending that the interests of individuals can be understood as separate from the structure of society, by pretending that Main Street, as we know it, can exist without Wall Street or without capital, the World Social Forum obscured the depth of both the problem and the potential of capitalism. For example, in the World Social Forum Charter, it is stated that the forum does not have a deliberative character, and that no one will be authorized on behalf of the forum or in any of its regularly held meetings to express positions to be considered attributable to all its participants. This means, of course, that nobody would be empowered to read the Charter at future meetings, unless it is presumed that the Charter is not binding upon its members. But if that is the case, then it is unclear whether or not the World Social Forum might be deliberative after all, and it is unclear whether people are really empowered to speak in the name of the forum despite the previous decision that nobody was allowed to assume such authority. Beyond this paradox, however, the other assumption is that political change can arise without social agreements, without restrictions, and without discipline. The assumption is that an atomized civil society can take power organically. The assumption is that individuals are already free and that they can cooperate in an unmediated way. In their book, The End of History, the Aufhebunga Bunga gang wrote that the more politicized strata, who preach horizontalism, also engage in abnegating their own authority. Instead of making a play for leadership of a movement, proposing ideas and letting these be openly contested, horizontalists hide behind a hyper-democratic facade of consensus and constant participation. What is needed in order to change the world is power. Political power, technological power, creative power. By becoming passive, these NGO radicals only offer a path away from radical change. Still, the abstract aim of the World Social Forum, this slogan, "Another world is possible," shouldn't be entirely abandoned. This could be a radical starting point if we were to toss aside the World Social Forum and ruthlessly critique ourselves and our thinking. Otherwise, the slogan is nothing but empty radical rhetoric, covering up a decidedly more conservative politics. And yet, reformism itself can't be avoided. Everything that appears in our society appears to be radical. Progressivism is nearly universal, and the aim to perfect liberal democratic institutions and laws is shared by both Republicans and Democrats. The only politicians and/or political thinkers who resist this aim without becoming radicals are on the fringe of mainstream politics, even though some of their ideas inform factions within the right-wing parties of liberalism. Those who oppose the aim of perfecting liberalism, who also oppose radical change, are reactionaries, but even they have to work within the context of this bourgeois progressive world.
What puts you on the right is you oppose the belief in human equality, the doctrine of human equality, that you believe that human beings are by nature unequal, and if you are a traditional conservative, you defend hierarchy as better than its alternatives. And in any case, you oppose any state attempt to level down differences, social differences, gender differences, because I think the state is pernicious and will always work in the opposite direction, and therefore I am strategically a radical libertarian. But it is not because for a moment I think that people should have right to any sort of lifestyle, they have a human right. I think that sort of given what is the political configuration or situation at the present time and what it is likely to be in the future, I would like to remove the state as much as possible from private or from public life.
We can't avoid how our conception of freedom, our conception of socialism, is informed by the bourgeois world that has been unevenly emerging since the 11th century. Rather than seeking out a politics that appears to be radical, rather than trying to move from the world as it is to another world through mere opposition or negation, we have to consider just what exists now. What could be transformed in the service of eliminating the class basis, the current fundamental unfreedom, of our supposedly free society? Thinking through what changes we want, predicting the results from our own hopefully radical activity is necessary, but our plans will never accurately and fully capture all the outcomes in advance. For example, if we look back to history, for instance to Paul Maddox's Reform or Revolution, he explores how the Second International embraced the state as a capitalist institution that could, if properly altered, facilitate the creation of socialism. It was thought that the complete monopolization of capital does do away, at least ideally, with competitive market relations and thereby allows for a measure of conscious control of the economy and thus impairs or ends the value determination of social production. It was for this reason that the aim was conceived of as creating one great factory and transforming all citizens into employees of the state. That was socialism. But Maddox believed that even in theory, this would not suffice because while this may allow the state to remove the fetishistic character of the commodity and replace it with conscious control, it would not remove the reality of wage labor, nor of commodity production itself. To me, it is unclear just what might result from the creation of one global state that controls the distribution of commodities, or from one global enterprise that monopolizes all production. Such a state would have to determine some other basis for distribution, and under such conditions, it is not at all clear what a worker's wage would be worth, or why workers would even seek wages, unless the state is still operating within the realm of value. If it is, even in just a very roundabout way, the state will still be subjected to the rules and limited by the contradictions inherent in the exploitation of labor. In his book, The Writing on the Wall, Anselm Jappe pointed out that ours is the only society that has ever existed that contains in its foundation a dynamic contradiction rather than a mere antagonism. The transformation of labor into value is historically doomed to exhaustion because of the technologies that replace labor. Automation, innovation, and mass production themselves could lead to a kind of socialism, but only if the machines and factories can not only be put into the hands of socialists, whether these socialists operate through the state, through workers' councils, or through some other political form, but also transformed. What reforms might lead to this transformation of the material forces, the transformation of our social relations, and the overcoming of class, can't be answered unless we dare to imagine just what new value and attendant social relations, what new basis for cooperative work we are seeking. According to Maddock, the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats alike sought to create bourgeois society and capitalist relations in Russia. What marked the Bolsheviks as socialists were their ambitions to eventually join in a socialist struggle that would actually emerge in the more developed nations, specifically Germany. But in Germany, the Social Democrats were convinced that by gaining power through the parliament, by working alongside bourgeois forces in an effort to maintain enough power to then be able to transform society from the inside, they could create socialism. And the idea of one big monopoly managed by the state in the interest of the workers was the horizon of social democratic thought and Bolshevism both. Today, we operate at a lower level. For the most part, we don't even imagine overcoming capitalism at all, but remain on the level of a reformist politics that only wants to create capitalism with a human face. But for those who still imagine themselves as radicals or as socialists, the task is to work through the history of socialist struggle and the present conditions simultaneously. And this is why, in the next video, I'll be returning to the left technocratic tradition in America and re-examining Marx's critique of utopian socialism.